Good morning. Welcome to the last day of 2017. I don't know about you, but I'm finding it very hard to believe that we've gone through another year already. People always say that time goes by faster when you get older, when you have kids, and you often don't believe it, but it is certainly the truth. This morning, we're going to be, as the screen shows, we're going to be looking at our text will be chapters 11 through most of 13 in Exodus, where Pharaoh actually lets the Israelites go. But as normal, let's do a quick review of some of the things we talked about last week. Early in our text last week, we talked about how God had reiterated to Moses that he would harden Pharaoh's heart. And though God would perform miraculous signs and wonders throughout Egypt, Pharaoh would refuse to listen to Moses and refuse to let the Israelites go. But that the ruler's refusal would actually multiply the mighty acts of judgment God would use to free his people from Egypt. And these mighty acts would prove to the Egyptians that the God of Israel was sovereign Lord over the universe. So Moses and Aaron demonstrated God's power by inflicting a series of horrendous plagues on Egypt. And throughout these plagues, Pharaoh continued and consistently refused to let the Israelites go. And then after we talked about those first 9 plagues there, we talked about who hardened Pharaoh's heart and how skeptics have tried to use this story of God hardening Pharaoh's heart to point out that, or to make an accusation that God was mistreating Pharaoh by hardening his heart and yet punishing him for that very same action. And we talked about a couple of explanations that are available that explain the declarations out of Exodus. And both explanations had to deal with the fact that every language has its own way of using certain types of words and phrases, figurative speech, if you will, and that the use of that figurative speech may not be familiar to those that aren't familiar with the language. There are also action verbs used that don't actually point toward a completed action, but actually to the intended outcome. And also we talked about the use of metonymy, which is a closely associated metaphor where one name or word is employed for another. An example of that was when we were talking about how when we read Shakespeare, we're not literally reading Shakespeare, but we're reading his writings or plays. So in the case of Pharaoh, ultimately God hardened Pharaoh's heart. That's what we read in text, in the sense that God provided the circumstances and the occasion for Pharaoh to be forced to make a decision. And Pharaoh made up his own mind to resist God's demands. He did this of his own accord, and he stubbornly refused to comply. As we move into today's text, we're going to pick up right after the plague of darkness. And apparently while Moses was still in Pharaoh's presence after the plague of darkness, the Lord informed him that he would have one more plague in store for Egypt. Up to this time, Moses evidently didn't really know how many plagues would be inflicted. He just followed God's instruction. But at this point, God told him he had one more. God told Moses that after the 10th plague, Pharaoh would be so exasperated that he would drive the Israelites out of the land, in chapter 11, verse 1. But before leaving Egypt, the Israelites were to plunder the Egyptians, and the Lord described to Moses how this was to be done. The Israelites were simply to ask their Egyptian neighbors for articles of silver and gold. The Egyptians, who had been made favorably disposed, if you will, toward both Moses and the Israelites, would willingly hand over said items. After all they had suffered through with the 10 plagues, they were ready to do pretty much anything to get the Israelites out and to get relief. Before leaving Pharaoh, Moses conveyed what God had told him. The Lord had sworn to go throughout the land at about midnight, killing the firstborn sons of the Egyptians, from the highest social levels to the lowest. He would also kill the firstborn offspring of the Egyptians' livestock. And because of this, the massive number of deaths that would occur, the Egyptians would mournfully wail throughout the night, we read in verses 4 through 6. 6 of the previous 9 plagues had been initiated with the use of Moses or Aaron's staff. But this final plague was different in that it would fall on the Egyptians directly from God. No action, no intervention was needed on Moses or Aaron's behalf. In the end, it would be clear to both the Egyptians and to the Israelites that this judgment was inflicted by the hand of God, and that was the intent. We read, as we go into verses 6 and 7, how in contrast to the wailing of the Egyptians when this was happening, God said there would be peace among the Israelites. The Egyptians' wailings and the Israelites' silence would mark the distinction between God's favor for those who worship him and his judgment of those who worship other gods. So through Moses, God also told Pharaoh that after the plague of the firstborn, the rulers' officials would bow before Moses, that they would beg that he leave and request that he lead the Israelites away from Egypt. And Moses would honor this request by delivering his people from slavery, in verse 8. We read at the end there of 8 that Moses was enraged at Pharaoh's unwillingness and acknowledgement of God's power. So he actually stormed out of the royal court, and he left Pharaoh in stunned silence. In verses 9 through 10, got behind on my slides there. In verses 9 and 10, we read, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not listen to you, so that my wonders will be multiplied in the land of Egypt. Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, yet the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the sons of Israel go out of his land." These verses, they summarize the fact that all along Pharaoh had refused to listen to Moses and to obey God. And his refusal had brought about the plagues on all the land. And at this point, it was about to bring the most brutal and devastating plague of all. In chapter 12, as we go into chapter 12, we actually read about the Passover lamb. And I'm getting ahead of myself. So what God was about to do for his people was going to be momentous. So he told Moses and Aaron to assemble the people together and to give them his instructions. He wanted the Israelites to remember his act of deliverance, but he wanted them to actually celebrate it as well. The Israelites' freedom from Egypt would be for them a new beginning as God's people. Therefore, even though the events that were about to occur would happen in the 7th month, known as Habib, of the civil year, God declared that the month of Habib should be recognized as the first month of the year. And God said that while striking down the firstborn of Egypt, he would pass over the people of Israel. This act would lead to the release of the Israelites from bondage. And the celebration of the Passover would become the most significant of the holy days for the Israelites. So God's instructions on how to celebrate the Passover were the only regulations he gave the Israelites while they were still being held as slaves. To institute this day of commemoration, each Israelite household was to begin by making preparations on the 10th day of the month of Abib by selecting a lamb for roasting. If there were too few people in the household to eat a whole lamb, 2 or more households could share one. We read in verses 3 and 4. The lamb that was to be used was a 1-year-old male that had no defects. They were to slaughter the lamb, very specific instructions. They were to slaughter the lamb at twilight on the 14th day of Abib and apply its blood to the door frames of their houses. Because the 10th plague would be different than all the others where God protected the Israelites had to actually take action here. They actually had to prepare for it and heed God's warning. And by doing this, they would demonstrate their faith in God's provisions for their lives. Specific instructions were given on exactly what the Israelites were to do on the night of the Passover. And we read this in verses 8 through 11, chapter 12. They shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled at all with water, but rather roasted with fire, both its head and its legs, along with its entrails. And you shall not leave any of it over until morning, but whatever is left of it until morning you shall burn with fire. Now you shall eat it in this manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. So through Moses and Aaron, God informed the Israelites clearly what he was about to do. By sending the 9 plagues, God had judged both Pharaoh and many of the gods of Egypt. But now in this last blow, he would bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. That night, God's presence would roam throughout Egypt, bringing about the death of the firstborn offspring of both humans and animals. But those that obeyed God and that applied blood to their doorframes would be spared. The night of Passover was only the beginning of the Israelites' celebration. God wanted the Israelites to commemorate the event by celebrating a week-long festival. On the first day of the Passover, they were to remove all yeast from their houses. Then for the following 7 days, they were to eat bread that had been made without yeast. A sacred assembly, a time to worship God, would mark the beginning day of the end of the festival and the ending of the festival. So God's instructions are restated in verses 17 through 20, where the week-long festival is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Also reiterated is the command for the Israelites to cast out those who, during the observance, eat anything with yeast in it. God expects everyone within the covenant community to participate, no exceptions, and he even made an allowance for Gentile converts to celebrate with the Israelites. After being told what God wanted him to say, Moses gathered the elders of Israel together and conveyed to them God's instructions regarding the Passover, the very specific instructions. Moses told them to apply the lamb's blood to their doorframes with a bunch of hyssop. Something similar to this. Hyssop was a common plant in the Near East. It had stiff, hairy stems and leaves that could hold water or blood well, similar to what we'd use for a paintbrush. Moses told the elders that once the Israelites had entered their houses near the end of the land, they were not to leave their homes until daybreak. And as the Lord went through the land, he would notice the doors marked with blood, and no one within those homes would be harmed. The destroyer who would take the lives of the Egypt's firstborn was probably an angel of the Lord. Moses reminded the elders that the Passover observance was not to be a one-time event, but an annual celebration. Each generation of the Israelites was to be taught both the reenactment and the meaning of the Passover. So following Moses' instructions, the Israelites bowed down and worshiped the Lord, realizing that their deliverance was about to occur. No doubt it must have been some excitement there. They were about to be freed. But I would also imagine there was some fear as well. So then they returned to their homes, where they observed the first time the Passover celebration. We read, at midnight, with the Israelites safe in their homes, the Lord performed the most horrifying of the 10 plagues. All of Egypt's firstborn sons, regardless of their social standing, died that very hour. Even the firstborn among the Egyptians' livestock perished. We read in verse 29. In the middle of the night, Pharaoh and all the other Egyptians were awakened, perhaps by the wailing of one household awaking the neighboring household as they saw what had happened after the tragedy had struck. But whatever the case, all of Egypt had begun to mourn its massive losses. We read in verse 30. God had told Moses that the king of Egypt would not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. And now God's mighty hand had struck. Death had touched every Egyptian family. In verses 30 through 34, Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron at night and said, "Rise up, get out from among my people, both you and the sons of Israel, and go, worship the Lord as you have said. Take both your flocks and your herds as you have said, and go and bless me also." So distraught over his own son's death, Pharaoh evidently retracted his earlier oath that the next time he saw Moses he would kill him. And he actually summoned Moses and Aaron and ordered them to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, taking all their possessions. But as you see there at the end of verse 32, before sending Moses and Aaron away, Pharaoh blurted out a last request that is the equivalent of admitting defeat. And he says, "And also bless me." Pharaoh, who we talked about earlier, was considered a god by the Egyptians, was admitting that neither his power nor the power of the gods of Egypt was any match for the power of the God of Israel. So, like Pharaoh, the Egyptians urged the Israelites to leave quickly as they feared they would all be wiped out if they did not leave quickly. We read this in verse 34. But on their way out, the Israelites remembered the instructions they had been given and remembered what God had told them about asking for the articles of silver and gold from the Egyptians. And we read in verses 35 and 36, when they made the request, the Egyptians rushed to hand over whatever they asked for. The first leg we read about as we go into 37, of the Israelites fleeing, and I get behind, was from Ramesses to Succoth, a southeasterly journey, which you can kind of see, if I can get the pointer to work. Up. Oh, I knew I was going to do that. Wrong buttons. Touchy. Right up in here. A little journey there. A distance that's not very far. It was about 60 miles. About 600,000 men, in addition to the women and children, made the trip. We read in verse 37. Must have been quite a sight to see that many making that journey. Joining the Israelites on their journey, we read, were people who were apparently so impressed by the power, or with the power of God and his relationship to his people, that they joined the covenant community. Many Bible scholars estimate that the whole company of sojourners may have equaled 2 or 3 million people. Traveling along, too, were large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds, we read in verse 38. In verses 40 through 51 of chapter 12, the writer of Exodus pointed out that the people of Israel had spent 430 years to the very day, we see in verse 41, in Egypt when the Lord let them out. Because non-Israelites traveled with the Israelites into the wilderness, it became necessary to provide additional Passover regulations. The Lord actually said non-Israelites who did not identify with the covenant community through circumcision should not be allowed to celebrate Passover. But he said that a foreigner who was willing to identify himself by being circumcised would be welcomed into the Passover celebration. As we move into chapter 13, verses 1 through 16, we're reading about the Israelites' first days as they journey into the wilderness. And at this point, God reminded Moses to be sure the people observed the Passover celebration. And yet, God wanted the people to remember his deliverance more often than just 1 week a year. So he instructed Moses to tell the Israelites to set apart for God's purpose the first male born into every human family, every flock or every herd, in verses 1 and 2. He's ordering the firstborn to be consecrated. So responding to the Lord's instructions, Moses reminded the people to mark the day of their departure from Egypt by refraining from eating bread made with yeast. And even when arriving to the Promised Land, or in the Promised Land, Moses said the people were to remember and commemorate the day of that Exodus began. So as we go into verses 8 through 10, in anticipation of the children's questions about the observance, Moses said their explanation should point at how the Lord brought them out of the land of Egypt by performing miracles. And observing the Passover would serve as a constant reminder for God's people to obey the laws the Lord would give them. Then Moses conveyed to the people what God had said about consecrating their firstborn sons to the Lord. Moses said once the people arrived in their new homeland, they would be obligated to give over to the Lord their first sons and firstborn among their livestock. Because the firstborn among the Israelites had been spared in the 10th plague, the Lord wanted his people to acknowledge that their firstborn belonged to him, in verses 11 and 12. God allowed one exception to this law, and we read that later in the chapter, where because donkeys were valuable for carrying the people's goods, they could be redeemed by sacrificing lambs in their stead. To redeem meant to obtain release by means of payment. If a firstborn donkey was not redeemed, the people were required to break its neck. Verse 13. Firstborn sons were always to be redeemed by sacrificing a lamb. In this way, human beings were being consecrated to God by their lives instead of by their deaths. Again, Moses emphasized the importance of retelling the story of how God had delivered the Israelites out of Egypt. Generations yet to be born and those who were not old enough to remember the Exodus would learn, or they would need to learn, why the firstborn animals were sacrificed and why the firstborn sons of each family were consecrated to the Lord and redeemed by the sacrifice of the lamb. That actually covers our key text for this morning. But I'd like to spend the remainder of our time talking, kind of following up with what we were talking about last week with the atheistic viewpoint of this story, and talk about the atheistic view of chapter 12, basically, and how they claim that this shows that God is immoral for killing innocent children, the innocent children of the Egyptians. Many atheists claim that atheism actually offers the world a superior system of morality when compared to the moral system presented in the Bible. I don't know how many of you have heard of Dan Barker, but he's a professed atheist with the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And he stated, "We can know that the atheistic way is actually a superior, intellectual, and moral way of thinking." One primary reason Dan gave for this belief is that the Bible's morality is flawed, in that the Bible states that God has directly killed people, and that God has authorized others to kill as well. In his book, Godless, Barker said, "There is not enough space to mention all of the places in the Bible where God committed, commanded, or condoned murder." The idea that God is immoral because he has killed humans it's standard atheistic fare. That's one of their most common arguments. In his letter to a Christian Nation, Sam Harris, another well-known atheist writer, cited several Bible verses in which God directly or indirectly caused people to die. And after referring to those verses in the book, he then stated, anyone who believes that the Bible offers the best guidance we have on questions of morality has some very strange ideas about either guidance or morality. In his atheistic bestseller, The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins wrote the following as the opening paragraph of chapter 2. Take a look at this. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Somebody's proud of their vocabulary there. I think so. But, wow, what a statement. But the atheist community eat this kind of stuff up. So is it true? This is obviously a rhetorical question. Is it true that atheism offers a superior morality to that found in the Bible? And is the God of the Bible immoral for advocating or directly causing the deaths of millions of people? I believe everyone in here and everyone watching would answer that with an emphatic no. But why? And for one reason, atheism cannot offer moral judgments. The extreme irony of the atheistic argument against God's morality is that atheism is completely impotent to define the term moral, much less the use of the concept against any other system. William Provine, on February 12, 1998, a well-known historian and evolutionist, delivered a speech on the campus of the University of Tennessee. And in an abstract of that speech, his introductory comments are recorded saying the following words: naturalistic evolution has clear consequences that Charles Darwin understood perfectly. 1, no gods worth having exist. 2, no life after death exists. No ultimate foundation for ethics exists. No ultimate meaning in life exists. And human free will is non-existent. Provine believes that naturalistic evolution has no way to produce, number 3 there, no ultimate foundation for ethics. So Oxford professor Richard Dawkins concurred with that, saying absolutist moral discrimination is devastatingly undetermined by facts of evolution. So if evolution, or if atheism is true, and human beings evolved from non-living primordial slime, then any sense of moral obligation must simply be subjective outworking of the physical neurons in the brain. I mean, theoretically, atheistic scientists and philosophers admit this truth. Charles Darwin understood this truth perfectly. And he wrote, "A man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or of a future existence with retribution and reward can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem to him the best ones." Dan Barker admitted this truth in a debate when he stated, "There are no actions in and of themselves that are always absolutely right or wrong. It depends on the context." Oh, does this sound familiar to this world today? You cannot name an action that is always absolutely right or wrong. I can think of an exception in any case. I can't think of an exception in any case. So let's think about this. If there is no moral standard other than human impulses and instincts, as mentioned by these well-known and atheistic leaders, then any attempts to accuse another person of immoral behavior boils down to nothing more than one person not liking what the other person is doing. While the atheist may claim not to like God's actions that we read about here with the Egyptians, if he admits that there is a legitimate standard of morality that is not based on subjective human whims, then in reality he's forfeited his atheistic position. If actions can accurately be labeled as objectively moral or immoral, then atheism simply cannot be true. So to follow this line of thinking, if there truly are cases of justice and injustice, God must exist. Another point that defeats the atheistic view on God killing innocent children is that atheism has no moral qualms about killing innocent children. A closer look at atheistic morality quickly reveals that atheists do not believe that it is morally wrong to kill all innocent children. According to the atheistic community, abortion is viewed as moral. In a debate, Dan Barker said that abortion is a blessing. One line of reasoning used by atheists to justify the practice is the idea that humans should not be treated differently than animals, since humans are nothing more than animals themselves. The fact that an embryo is human is no reason to give it special status. So isn't it ironic that atheists claim that God could not cause the death of an unborn fetus, human fetus, and still be considered moral, and yet the bulk of the atheistic community adamantly maintains that those fetuses are the moral equivalent of rabbits? So how can the atheist accuse God of immorality while claiming to have a superior morality when the atheist has no moral problem killing babies? It makes no sense. In response, God's accusers attempt to draw a distinction between a fetus in its mother's womb and a child already born. But that distinction has actually been demolished by one of their own. Peter Singer, the man that Dan Barker lodges as one of the world's leading ethicists, admits that an unborn child and the one already born are morally equivalent. So does this admission force him to the conclusion that abortion should be stopped? Oh, no. To the contrary, he believes we should be able to kill children that are already born. In his chapter titled Justifying Infanticide, Singer concluded that human infants are replaceable. So what does he mean by replaceable? Well, he points out that if a mother has decided that she will have 2 children, and the second one is born with hemophilia, then that infant can be disposed of and replaced by another child without violating any moral codes of ethics. So it is clear then that atheism does not have any moral constraints against killing all innocent babies, but rather only those innocent babies that the atheistic community considers worthy to live. How in the world would a person make a moral judgment about which children were worthy to live? Well, in their minds, Singer and Harrison and others contest that a child's age in utero, mental capability, physical disability, or other criteria should be used to formulate the answer. So once again, the atheistic argument must be further qualified. We started off saying that they were saying that God is immoral because he killed people. So now we've looked at, well, God is immoral because he killed innocent babies. Now it's gone to God is immoral because he killed innocent babies that we feel would not have met our atheistically based criteria for death. Their argument keeps shifting as facts are brought out. And ultimately, then, the atheistic position argues that atheists, not God, should be the ones who decide when death of an innocent child is acceptable. Ultimately, we all understand that God is the sole authority in matters of human life and death. And the fact that all physical life originates with God gives him the prerogative to decide when and how that physical life should be maintained. In speaking of human death, the writer of Ecclesiastes said, "Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it." The Apostle Paul boldly declared to the pagan Athenians, that in God we live and move and have our being, in Acts chapter 17, verse 28. If God gives all life to all humans, then only he has the right to say when that life has accomplished its purpose, or under what circumstances life may be legitimately terminated. In addition to the fact that God gives life and thus has the authority to take it, he also has the power to give it back if he chooses. Throughout the Bible, we read of instances in which God chose to give life back to those who were dead. The most thoroughly documented example of that being the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In fact, Abraham alluded to this fact during the preparations to sacrifice Isaac. Since God gives physical life to all, and since he can raise people from the dead, then any accusation of injustice that fails to take these facts into account cannot be legitimate. So why would I mention all this stuff? Well, there's some scary points of view out there. It is evident that atheism has zero grounds upon which to attack God's character, yet they continue to try. Atheists contend that a loving God should not kill innocent babies. But those same atheists say that killing innocent babies would be a blessing under the right circumstances that they tend to define. Atheists contend that God is immoral for taking the lives of innocent children. Yet the atheist believes that it is permissible to take the lives of innocent children when doing so, according to their belief, means that those children are being robbed of the sum total of their existence. Yet, according to the biblical perspective, those children are being spared a life of pain and misery, and they're being ushered into a life of eternal happiness. Atheism contends that its adherents are in a position to determine which children should live and die. And yet the acknowledgement of the consequences of such decisions goes far beyond their human capability. Only an omniscient God would know the consequences involved. I believe we all understand that. The atheist contends that human life can be taken by other humans based solely on reasoning about benefits to society and other relativistic ideas. The biblical position shows that God is the giver of life, and only he has the authority to decide when that life has accomplished its purpose. In reality, the atheistic view proves to be the only truly immoral position. So while many of us can look at the happenings here with the 10th plague and wonder and think it's harsh, think that it shows a side of God that, people will use this to say, well, I don't want to serve a God that does that. our little brains, they can't we can't grasp all the workings of God. We're told we're not going to be able to. So atheists will use texts like this in the Bible to forward their thoughts, their thought processes, and try to tear down the God of the Bible. So that's the reason I brought this up this morning, is just so we can have a better understanding of a lot of the viewpoints that are being professed throughout the country, throughout the world. Dangerous viewpoints that can lead to people's souls being lost. Next week, we're going to be talking about chapter 13, verse 17 through chapter 15, verse 21, where the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. If you would, bow with me in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we come before you now thanking you for your word. Lord, we pray that you will help us to study your word more earnestly, to try to grasp and understand your word. Lord, help us to be better armed to defend your word to those we come in contact with. There is a movement out there, it's nothing new, but there is a movement out there that is systematically trying to destroy the idea of the Bible, the words that we have been given to live by. It is a work of Satan, Lord, and we know this, but please help us to be better armed to fight these points of view, to express to those that are hearing them that it is not truth, but it is the thoughts of man. Lord, please help us to always seek the opportunities to spread your word, not to be fearful because we may be accused of something, not be fearful because we do not understand the viewpoints of these groups, the atheistic groups. Please help us to always be eager to defend our faith in you. Please be with us as we go through the rest of this service. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.